Okay, folks, so here it is, the last video for the week. Hallelujah! Parable of Talents, right? And we're going to do the joy essay, right? So what happens in this essay, guy goes on a journey, brings his slaves. First of all, highly problematic, right? Thinking about the fact that this text was used to actually endorse and support and justify slavery, right? But there were slaves back then, and that's the way this text was used in the antebellum South, obviously, and throughout colonization, actually, to justify slavery. Right, Jesus speaking in the terms of his time to people in their own context, right? This guy brings his slaves. He says, listen, 5 talents to you, 2 to you, 1 to you, according to your ability. So he goes away. And he says, again, this is a parable, right? He says, so the one who with 5, he went off, the guy traded him, he got 5 more. So now he has 10, right? The same way the 2, he made 2 more, right? But the one who had received only 1 went off and dug a hole, and he hid it. So the master comes back, and the one who received 5 came back, gave him 5 more. Master gave me 5, here's 5. He says, well done, my good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I'll put you in charge of many. Enter into the joy of your master. The one with 2, he says, well done, good and trustworthy slave. You've been basically trustworthy with a few. I'll give you charge of more things, right? So enter my joy. Then the final one, right, who buries it, this is what he says to him. The slave says, Master, I knew you're a harsh man, reaping where you do not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid and I went and I hid it. So out of fear, he hid it because he knows that the master, what he's saying, is unjust. So here, have what's yours. The master says, you wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I do not sow and gather where I do not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have had more, because that's the way that I work, right? I want to gain interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with 10 talents. For to those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So interesting, right? Because if we take this literally, right, if we take a parable literally, then Jesus is saying, like, that this is pretty much okay, right? Almost like condoning it. But he's actually using it as a metaphor, right, for taking often it's read, taking the talents that what God has given you and multiplying that, right? Being responsible with it and even, magnifying that or exponentially growing that. But interesting words, right, to hear come out of the mouth of Jesus. So we have David Joy reading this, right? And he says, unfortunately, the parable has been misused to subjugate the weak, the vulnerable, the less privileged, and the voiceless, he says. Right, so this text has actually been used, right, even to justify slavery, as I said, right, and to justify masters operating in this way. He says, for example, in India, migrants in the lower caste are inevitably branded as people with less talent and less worth, and the parable has been interpreted as support for their continued oppression. Likewise, the parable has been used to promote capitalism, which typically leads to the suffering of those who cannot produce capital. For whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him, right? Unless you can produce capital within a capitalist society, you are not seen as valuable as those who can. Thus, there's a significant need to launch a fresh reading, he says. This article is an attempt to read the parable through the eyes of the peasants of first-century Palestine, whose lives in many ways were analogous to a large portion of the population in India, right? So if you think about the world in front, David Joy is reading from India. I believe that such a reading will bring out the liberative meaning of the parable and the gospel truth which it contains, right? He also clearly is a presbyter of the church, so he's a Christian here speaking about this text. Many parables of Jesus reflect the fact that Palestine was occupied by Roman forces during that time. Again, really important to understand that Jews, as we talked earlier in the week, that Jews, or in the videos, Jews were, it feels like a week, that Jews were looked down on within the Roman Empire, right? Rome had occupied much of the Mediterranean region, including Jerusalem. So, thus, the sayings, the parables, and the miracles of Jesus need to be studied against the context of Roman colonialism, right? Such an appropriate such an approach is particularly relevant in today's world where millions of people become migrants and homeless due to liberal economic capitalist policies. Our so-called subaltern cultural reading is concerned with the location, condition, and mindset of the ordinary people in Jesus' audience. In this particular parable, it pays special attention to the third servant. Why is he afraid of the master? Why is he treated so harshly? What reaction is the audience supposed to have to the servant and to the master, right? How are we supposed to feel in light of this? What is Jesus actually trying to convey? To answer these questions, we must pay attention to the social, cultural, and economic context of the first century Palestine, as a number of modern commentators have done quite well. This parable, for instance, assumes a context in which a household had compliant slaves who would make every effort to benefit materially and socially their master in order to exemplify faithful discipleship. So this is like number 1 and number 2. The text offers no critique of the socioeconomic structure or of the particular activities of the obedient slaves. There's no critique here, which may very well involve accumulating wealth at the expense of others, as the third slave points out. The audience then is supposed to supply the critique. Namely, they are to recognize that the specific socioeconomic commitment of the master and the activities of the first 2 slaves are actually not to be imitated. So we have to read that into it, right? Jesus, again, not explaining clearly exactly what everything means. We here, with a critical mind, are thinking about the fact that, oh, wait a second, maybe this isn't actually, maybe the multiplication of these talents isn't necessarily a good thing because it's just following in line with what this master has already been doing, which the third slave is providing that critique, right? This is not okay, right? You're harsh and you're evil, and now he's going to cast this slave out and dehumanize the slave to an even larger degree, right? This reading is supported by several factors in the text. So first, the third servant claims that the master has acquired his wealth through dishonest means, right, which we just said. Second, the master's response to the servant seems obviously cruel and unfair, which we also just mentioned, not to mention exaggerated and absurd. In some, though this parable might smack of capitalism, it's more clearly a critique of it, which Jesus presumes the audience will actively supply. The parable, then, is one which presents the vulnerability of the oppressed class in Palestine. More specifically, it calls attention to the world of retainers, people who are part of the system of social dependency for survival in the household of a powerful elite. The audience's sympathy for the wounded psyche of the fearful and helpless servant can actually translate into a motivation to work on behalf of, Joy says, the homeless, the migrants, and all dispossessed people in India, or any other economic context which exploits a segment of the population. Perhaps it can also inspire the disenfranchised to stand up and, in fact, demand dignity, just like this third servant. In the name of social and political power, too many people have been denied the basic necessities of life for too long. In this parable, Jesus challenges the political and economic systems by affirming that everyone ought to have a rightful place in God's just world, right? So a dramatic rereading of this, right? We're not on the side of now the master, but we're thinking with that third slave who is mistreated by the master.